This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm speaking to you from my office in my hometown of Helensburgh today, which is normally where I do my recording. It's northwest of Glasgow and sits on the River Clyde. Well, we now find ourselves in the latter part of September, and the broody, cloudy days are shortening, while the leaves are starting to cover the lawn, and nearly all the apples have fallen from the trees in the back garden. My cat Tommy 2, we lost Tommy 1 a few years ago, is not wandering too far from the house and appears to be spending more time inside next to the radiator than he used to only a couple of weeks ago. Yes, autumn is upon us, and the warm summer days are fading from memory. Now, I can already hear those of you living in warmer climes chuckling to themselves at me talking about warm summer days in Scotland. But don't laugh, we do get the occasional warmish day. In today's podcast, we're going to be walking around the cathedral city of Inverness and hear about its heroes and villains of the past. Why was its castle destroyed in the 18th century, and by whom, and why was its replacement in the 19th century built to resemble a real castle? What is Inverness' connection to the Loch Ness Monster? And why was the last battle with hand-to-hand fighting taking place so close to the city back in 1746? All of these questions and conundrums will be answered here. This podcast is the first in my 3-part series, Inverness to Gairloch, and will focus in this part 1 on the locality of the town. What I try to do with these virtual journeys is to share with you all that Scotland has to offer, and if you intend to visit this wonderful country at some stage in the future, then perhaps your tour might be shaped by some of what you discover here. And visit my website, www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, to hear more of my tours and see some wonderful photos and videos that I've taken associated with all my own journeys around Scotland. Well, whatever way you intend to enjoy Scotland, then I hope that by listening to this podcast and viewing my monthly video podcast, and there's also YouTube videos under Exclusive Scottish Visits, you get a feel for what this magical land of the Scots has to offer. So I'd like you now to relax wherever you are and thoroughly enjoy the first part of your Unique Scotland tour from Inverness to the Gairloch. Take time out for the next 15 to 20 minutes to enjoy a wee look at Scotland through a Scotsman's eye. Coming up from the south, through the Great Glen on the west coast, you pass Loch Ness, then soon enter the outskirts of the city of Inverness. The first thing that strikes you as you enter the city is that it appears to be a small town hugging the banks of the fast-flowing River Ness that runs right through the middle of the town. Indeed, the word Inverness is translated from Gaelic as Inver, at the mouth of, and Ness as the River Ness, so the town or city at the mouth of the River Ness. But it's larger than it seems, with the rest of Inverness sprawling to the south, the east and the west, with the Moray Firth to the north. The Moray Firth leads all the way out to the North Sea on the eastern coast of Scotland. I mention this because there is a canal that joins Inverness with Fort William. That leads out into Loch Linnhe that connects with the Atlantic on the west coast. And this gives a connection between east and west coasts. I've actually covered this in detail in previous podcasts, so I'm not going to go into it here. Inverness was a town only 20 years ago, but it's now a cathedral city and gained that fame in 2000. It was one of 6 in Scotland created to mark the new millennium. Now, city status in the United Kingdom is granted by the monarch, and although it carries no special privileges or rights, it can be a marker of prestige and pride. And it can also bring with it financial grants from central government. The roots of Inverness are ancient and go back as far as the 6th century, when local tribes known as the Picts occupied the area. And we know this because of documentary evidence in the form of a biography written by a scribe, Adomnan, who said that St Columba visited the area to spread the word of God and to convert the Picts to Christianity. The records refer to a King Brood. They also refer to the local people who requested that St Columba rid Loch Ness of a terrible sea monster that terrorised local communities. So even in the 6th century, the Loch Ness Monster was being talked about. It's clear, however, that with recent sightings of the monster, that St Columba failed in his attempts to rid the loch of this dark and terrible creature. Now, if you listen to my podcast 4, Inverness to Edinburgh, you will hear my personal testimony as to having seen the monster myself. And I will repeat here that that had nothing to do with me spending the evening in the Drumnadrochit pub. Inverness has a rather sad and bloody history, caused mainly by its strategic location at the head of the Great Glen, and also a deep-water seaport leading out onto the Moray Firth. And this history is directly linked to the castle. And it's when you reach the river and start to cross the road bridge, you're immediately struck by the castle, a fabulous red sandstone building up on a hill overlooking the river. This is a very new building, dating from 1836, and is the latest in a long line of castles that have been ravaged by conflict throughout the centuries. No sooner had the good folk of Inverness built a new protective bastion when invaders would arrive and knock it down. Annoying, to say the least. The first castle in this site was built in the 11th century by King Malcolm III, who had an even earlier castle, about a mile away, and he had it dismantled. And if you're into Shakespeare, this earlier castle was meant to be the place where Macbeth murdered Duncan. So the 11th century castle was destroyed and rebuilt a number of times, and in the 14th century, during the Wars of Scottish Independence, and to prevent its use by the English, Robert the Bruce destroyed Inverness Castle. It was rebuilt in the 15th century, and the town prospered until the 17th century, when Great Britain became a republic, for a short while anyway, under Oliver Cromwell. And he used stone from ecclesiastic buildings locally to construct a huge citadel. But when, inevitably, Cromwell died and his reign came to an end, so did the citadel. But in Scottish history, the warfare and bloodletting, the jealousy, the territorial battling, the backstabbing and manoeuvring for position by the nobles to be near the king or queen were a continuous part of 16th and 17th century life. And so it was in 1548, when another castle on the site was completed by George Gordon, 4th Earl of Huntly. He was constable of the castle until the siege of Inverness in 1562, but he made the mistake of falling out with the Queen, Mary Queen of Scots, and Inverness was sieged by forces loyal to her, the Fraser and the Monroe clans. George Buchanan, a 16th century historian, states that when the unfortunate Queen went to Inverness in 1562 and found the gates of the castle shut against her, as soon as they heard of their sovereign's danger, a great number of the most eminent Scots poured in around her, especially the Frasers and Monroes, who were esteemed the most valiant of the clans inhabiting those countries in the north. These two clans took Inverness Castle for the Queen, which had refused her admission, and the Queen later hanged the governor who refused her entry. But it was in the 18th century, 1746 to be exact, when the Jacobite rebellion was at its height, that the last castle met its end. James Edward Stuart, or as he's better known, Bonnie Prince Charlie, took Inverness before the Battle of Culloden. Another story for another day. However, there is a lovely story which has been handed down the generations, and may or may not be true. After taking Inverness, the prince asked the castle governor to surrender, but when the governor refused, he set explosive charges all round the walls. At the appointed time of detonation, the charges had not gone off, so the armourer, accompanied by his wee Scotty dog, went forward to check the fuses. He got within a few yards of the charges when there was a massive explosion. Both the armourer and the wee dog were blown right across the River Ness, and I'm pleased to say the wee dog survived. So, to today's castle, which dates from 1836. It's a beautifully built red sandstone structure with bastioned enclosing walls, displaying an early castellated style. It was built as a prison, but today is more of an administration centre than a real castle. It used to house the Inverness Sheriff and Justice of the Peace Court, but they were moved in March this year. The castle is closed to the public, but the North Tower is accessible as a viewpoint. Well, with the space left behind by the moving of the courts, there is ongoing work to open up more of the castle to the general public and hopefully introduce a museum. Well, I was live on Facebook last weekend and stood in front of the castle to talk about a lovely statue of Flora MacDonald, the saviour of Bonnie Prince Charlie. So if you want to see the castle in all its glory, then have a look at the video. Flora's statue is super. I won't say more of her brave exploits to save the prince by helping him escape the British Army soldiers in the Outer Hebrides and bringing him to Skye, as there is a fuller explanation of her exploits in my podcast Tour of Skye, episode 2. And by the way, an illustration of the castle has featured on the reverse side of £50 banknotes issued by the Royal Bank of Scotland, which was introduced in 2005. Turning to the town itself, it has always been an important hub, sitting at the head of the Great Glen, with an exit to the sea and trade routes beyond to the near continent. The building of the Caledonia Canal and the arrival of the railways in the 19th century made it even more accessible and has enabled its growth to continue. The main industries during this period included shipbuilding, rope and sail making, tanning and wool, and there was a thriving sheep market as well. By the mid-20th century, the port remained a focus for industry, while the town developed into a focal point for the Highlands and, as the administrative centre for the Highlands Council, is regarded as the capital of the Highlands. It's a pity, therefore, that the impressive 19th century Victorian buildings disappeared in the 20th century to make way for modern developments. Now, clearly the city's trying to march with the time, but now that tourism is becoming a huge part of the local economy, it would have been nice to have some of the older buildings to view. I suppose that's easy for me to say. I don't have to pay to maintain them. Like all university towns and cities, there's a vibrancy about the place. Inverness College is the main campus for the Highlands and Islands University and hosts around a quarter of all students in that university, 30% of whom are studying to degree level. The interesting thing about the Inverness College is that it's one of 13 colleges that go to make up the Highlands and Islands University, and they range from the Shetland Islands, the Orkneys, Skye, Perth, and as far down as Argyll, just north of Glasgow. And there's also 70 local learning centres. Well, as it happens, Inverness is supposedly the happiest place to live in Scotland by a study conducted in 2015. And I have to say that I always feel happy when I visit Inverness. For example, the locals don't bite, the restaurants are good and varied, and there's plenty to do, and as I love to go for a jog in the morning, there's nothing better than a run along the river bank to clear the head for the forthcoming day. Well, Luscantire Beach in the Outer Hebrides may well beat this, but anyway, it's still a great way to start the day. As I said, there are many good restaurants in the town, and as I always share my favourites with my listeners, just in case you're coming this way, I do enjoy going to the Rock Pool, which is really 5-star, the Mustard Seed, Cafe One, the River House, and they all have some lovely Scottish fare, and all are on the banks of the river. Hotels I've stayed in are Glenmore, for its fab views over the river, Rock Pool, a wonderfully modernised hotel with luxury accommodation and meals, or Ness Walk, recently refurbished and offering excellent accommodation and meals as well. All excellent venues. If you really want to treat yourself, however, and I've stayed a couple of times myself, you just have to drive about 10 minutes out of town to find the fabulous Culloden House Hotel. It's an exquisite hotel with all the trappings of 5-star luxury you would expect. It's over 200 years old, originally an authentic 16th century Jacobean castle, and there's still parts of the house that date back to this time. It's also famous for looking after Bonnie Prince Charlie, who stayed there before the Battle of Culloden, and some of his artefacts can be found in the house. Well, coming back to the centre of the town, some of you may know that when I'm touring Scotland with guests, I wear the kilt, and if I need anything for my kilt attire, I love to pop into the Highland House of Fraser kilt shop. There's everything that you would want, and there's also a tour that you can do to see where and how the kilts are made. It's a great place to visit and perhaps buy or even hire a kilt for the day. One place I always visit if I'm staying over in Inverness is the Eden Court Theatre, with several different shows every year. There's 2 theatres, 2 cinema screens, and a lovely dining facility as well. It's a must if you're visiting the city. Well, this is the end of Inverness Part 1, and I'll be giving you a personal tour of the city in my next podcast, Inverness Part 2. After that, I'll be taking a tour up to Ullapool, over to the Gairloch, which is also part of the North Coast 500, and come back via Loch Marie, and tell you about Queen Victoria's visit to the area. In Inverness Part 2, I'll be taking you around the recently refurbished townhouse, the old toll booth tower dating from the 18th century, which I'm sure is leaning slightly at an angle, and also show you the oldest house in Inverness, Abertaft House, built in 1593, and I'll discuss Inverness in the 1600s. Well, thank you to the listeners who commented on the political shenanigans of Scotland in my last letter from Scotland, and a special thank you to Rob Mackey, who listens to my podcasts on his morning walk. Rob and I share the same name, as my middle name is Robert Mackay. Rob has asked if or when I'll be doing a podcast on Clan Mackay territory around Tongue, Bettyhill and Durness. That is now part of the North Coast 500. Well, that will be later in the year, Rob, so something to look forward to. As it happens, I was live on my Facebook group, Scotland the Beautiful, recently, walking along the Gairloch beach, which is also part of the NC 500, and there's much more of that to come. I now appear on a few channels, and you'll be listening to me either directly from the website or one of the Spotify, Google, Apple, etc., under the name of Unique Scotland. You can also find me on Twitter at ESVJohn, so look me up and follow, and do mention our connection. Well, I do hope that you've enjoyed this week's podcast as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. It's shorter than normal, as I'm splitting Inverness City into 2 podcasts, making them shorter than usual. There is a practical reason for this, and that is my grandkids are visiting tomorrow for the weekend, and as they are 3 boys of 5, 9 and 14, I just know that I will not get to my office to complete part 2 in time to get it published. Anyway, any comments are most welcome, and drop me a line using the contact page of my website, www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. Well, I wish you continuing health and happiness, and during these very strange times, stay safe. Whether you are on your morning walk with the whippets, or jogging along some lonely beach, or even sitting in the bath listening to this podcast and connecting with Scotland, I send you my very best wishes, and I raise my glass to you all. Slán Java.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.